Capacity. This is something that I am thrilled, and I don't use that word often, that we're finally discussing in a meaningful way. The reason is because we have a global pandemic and people are working from home. There are constraints now being placed on them that have to be acknowledged and dealt with, from kids running around in the back to the fact that they might not have a worker that is might not have the resources they once did in the office. They certainly can't have the water cooler conversations that they once did, and they're not existing in three dimensions, so they're not getting that same energy and sense of belonging that they would otherwise have in an office. And many organizations that work really, really hard to create these cultures that have felt not only safe but vibrant, where energy and ideas can be the source of productivity and innovation. So let me make some clear distinctions, and then I'm going to get into some specific examples. So productivity has been on the mind of business leaders for forever. How much can an individual produce for a certain amount of money over a certain period of time? And the idea is the more productivity we can get out of a worker, out of a human being, the better. What has been ignored, and I'll use that word intentionally, is the fact that we as human beings have limited capacity. We have limited time. And given that, we have to understand where that boundary is as an individual, and we have to have the gumption, we have to have the courage to say, no, this is all I can handle. Similarly, from an organizational perspective or a manager perspective, we have to understand that, okay, this is going to set somebody up for success. This is a reasonable amount of work and contribution they can deliver over this period of time for this investment. And this is where I get a little, like this. The strategy of throw work at people and have them figure it out. High performing people will just figure it out. I get it. It encourages resourcefulness and prioritization and all those good things. However, it does not acknowledge the well-being of the individual. It does not set that individual up for success, not only in business, but in his or her personal life, namely their relationships, their family, their physical well-being in terms of exercise and fitness, or other relationships that they might want to nurture in their lives day to day. So what happens? The people who are elevated and acknowledged for being, again, high performers are the ones that sacrifice their well-being, sacrifice their relationships, and in turn are elevated for outcompeting their peers who did not have the willingness to make those sacrifices. And that's a hard situation. As a virtuous person who wants to stay committed to relationships, you don't have relationships built in a car ride to school or a passing 10-minute meal at the end of the day so you can get back to your computer. Particularly now in this remote work environment, there is an increasing acknowledgement that time is in fact limited. So here to get to not necessarily the examples, but I want to point you to those who are creating these examples and offering solutions that help shed light on this dynamic. The dynamic being, this is the amount of work, this is the amount of time that we have to actually do the work. And if we can get better insight into the capacity of individuals and teams and groups to deliver the work relative to the work itself, then we can identify gaps. Then we can have a very open conversation about how to fill those gaps. We can hire more people. We can employ contractors to fill that gap temporarily. We can automate. We can work with outsourced providers. We can work with startup scale-ups. There's many ways to get that work done. And again, to emphasize what I've been talking about recently, is this notion of a work strategy. And that's where I would hope the people analytics discipline goes, is start facilitating discussions about how work gets done. And workers, namely employees, are just one piece of this larger way in which work gets done. So the examples, I was really taken aback by what Carly Scott Murphy had to say about how people are spending their time. She shed insight based on her visibility into the workplace analytics platform that Microsoft offers and that we use here internally, because it provides personal insight as well as organizational insight in terms of the number of meetings, the duration of those meetings. And she, somewhat unsurprisingly, but it was great to go from I think I know to knowing I know, that workers, while they work at home, are having more meetings than they used to, and they're of a shorter duration, which is great, which is understandable. But I want to highlight an example that I was privy to many years ago when I had the good fortune of working with Stanford University's Office of Development. We actually looked at the major gift officers at the university and identified the key contributors, the ones who had the unique ability to, over time, bring in more gifts than their peers. Now, there's a bunch of variables, and there was no judgment. It was full compassion. What we did not want to do is have it be like a sales organization. However, in the development world, there is this working hypothesis, or at least there was, that the more meetings you had, the more gifts that you would secure. Now, in identifying and isolating the high-performing major gift officers, we noticed something, that they were not the ones that had the most visits. They weren't the least visits either. They were actually pretty much right in the middle, swaying a little bit towards the fewer meetings per month per period. So why was that? Why was that a key insight? Without going through the whole narrative, they had time to prepare for meetings and they had time to follow up for meetings. It just wasn't meeting after meeting after meeting where you had too much to do afterwards and didn't have the capacity to address it. So are the workers in your organization able to prepare and do the requisite follow-up? Is the work truly understood? So if you're not using Workplace Analytics, if you're using Office 365, I highly suggest that you take a peek at it. There are certainly other tools. I had the pleasure of meeting and doing a podcast recently with Jan Reza, the CEO and founder of Time is Limited. Very taken aback by not only his approach, but the insights he and his tools are able to generate around all kinds of platforms that organizations use, not only the Office suite, but your chat platforms, whether it be Slack or what have you. And it identifies where people are spending their time, the frequency of communication, the length, the meat of the communication. In other words, how heavy it is. So obviously there's ethics and privacy considerations that are acknowledged. And speaking of that, Sharon Yaroslavsky, who was on the show last week, who did an outstanding job. She's a lawyer by trade, and she has a similar solution, which is different. But again, ultimately, these solutions and the examples that are increasingly coming to the fore are shedding light on our limitations around our capacity to contribute to the organization. So fast forward, imagine a world where we have visibility into what people can contribute day in and day out, week in and week out, and we can then identify the gaps and create ways to fill those gaps. Or conversely, if there's not enough or there's too much capacity, then we can decide how to reallocate people in the organization. If we have to let people go, then that's a reality of the market sometimes. But we can do it in a more educated way with the data and insights these solutions are now generating. So more to share on this, and we're going to now talk about the data to change process and where do I start? So we'll do that right after we come back from this commercial.